This is a video that I want to elaborate a point I briefly touched on yesterday with my video about the Holocaust and World War II, and that is a discussion of the idea of autarky and um, its role in the creation of wealth within society. Um, the primary motivation for Hitler was an idea that he wanted the German race to be prosperous, to be wealthy, to have a secure future. And from his thinking, which is a thinking that, by the way, most people even today still share, not just in Germany but in the United States, was that for that to happen, um, that whatever group you want to be wealthy, in his case the Germans, would need to have political control over basically a region that contained, you know, if not all, as many as possible natural resources in such abundance to make that wealth possible, and also to fund a military industrial complex capable of retaining political control over that geographical region. So this uh, within that paradigm, his attempt to take over huge swaths of land in the east makes perfect sense. And this is an idea that is very common even today in the United States. For when I was just a kid going to school, in high school, I had a history teacher who she had a reputation for being, one of the best teachers in our school. She's certainly one of the oldest. She'd been teaching almost 50 years by the time I had her. And she came right out and said, well, the reason the United States is rich is because it's so large and it has so many natural resources. It has so much oil, it has so much, iron and copper and coal and any number of other resources you care to name, gold, silver, uh, and that's why the United States is rich. And plenty of people over history have believed this and have acted upon it. Um, Politicians tend to look around, and when they see valuable natural resources, they tend to want to take them for themselves, and they can justify this on the notion that, well, in order for their people to prosper, they need to have control over those resources. Um, if we are to look at Germany before World War II, Germany lacked most types of natural resources. They had an abundance of coal, and with the right technology, that would actually have entailed an abundance of oil, although even today, that is not cost effective relative to getting just straight up oil from the ground. Um, but besides that, they did not have very much. They have some iron, but there are much higher quality and greater quantities available just to the north in Scandinavia and in other places as well. Um, so, and Germans were poor. Uh, People like to compare Germany to some kind of superpower juggernaut. This is, I think, a reflection of an attempt to make the war against them seem more um, substantial than it really was. In effect, we're talking about a regional European power, a powerful state within Central Europe, but one that was hemmed in by powers of at least equal power, specifically Great Britain and the USSR, and really France. Now, France was defeated very early, but when you stack them up, um, that was not luck, but a great strategic, I guess you could say, nullification of the strategic balance between the two. France had a vast empire, a pretty big industrial base, the ability to field and equip a large modern army, at least the equal of the Wehrmacht. Their tremendous defeat in the spring of 1940 kind of overshadows all that. But again, that book talked about how the fact that they had an air force about the size of the Luftwaffe with planes that were roughly of equal caliber and pilots that were roughly competent. Um, and as soon as the war started, actually, France and Britain both began buying um, basically entire air forces from the United States. They both placed orders for more than 500 planes. Just single orders, that's not counting. I think total, the two of them were asking for something like 6,000 or 7,000 planes before France was actually defeated. These are about the number of planes that the entire Luftwaffe had. So that's another point against the U.S. neutrality. The U.S. was basically giving air forces, and in the case of the U.K. navies, uh, to the Allies and not to the Germans. But that's another story. Um, and he talked about how, and this is also poorly people kind of all imagine that, the Germans had all these tanks, and they did have a large number of tanks, but most of them were Mark IIs and Mark IIIs, which most people aren't familiar with because they were puny, they had thin skins, and they didn't usually even have cannons. They were mounted with machine guns. They were not that advanced. They were not the Mark IVs and Fives, the Panthers and Tigers that are so infamous later. Germany only had a small handful of that type of tank. Main French battle tank was called the Char II, and there are reports, I'd like to look into this more, of single Char IIs slaughtering entire columns of German soldiers. These tanks were actually, one for one, qualitatively far superior than anything the Germans had. And the French actually had just as many of them as the Germans had tanks. Now their tactics were not as advanced and did not utilize the strengths of these vehicles, and so they were not decisive factors, although they very well could have been. Um, that's all a tangent. But if we look at Germany, though, like the standard of living in Germany was very low, especially if we compare it to the United States. That book I referenced yesterday has charts that show the per capita GNP, the average income. There are a couple companies, U.S. automakers especially, who had factories in Germany and in the United States. And I don't know about General Motors, who was kind of the larger of the two that had factories in both. But Ford did studies. They wanted to know, um, they wanted to compare the standard of living of their workers in Detroit with their workers in West Germany, and see, well, what kind of wages would it take to get them to be kind of the same. And basically what they had concluded was that the poorest workers, not just in their plants but anywhere in the United States, the poorest workers, this is circa the late 30s during the Depression, were several orders of magnitude wealthier than even much more skilled counterparts in Germany. They had more living space. They had better diet with much more meat, much more variety. They were very likely to own an automobile, which was a rare occurrence in Germany, even though Hitler had a fetish for trying to encourage automobile ownership. Even with the government subsidies in Germany, uh, at no point during the Third Reich, or even for several decades after that, did automobile ownership in Germany ever approach the levels in the United States, even though in the United States the government was taking no steps whatsoever to encourage people to own them, other than building roads, which they didn't really start doing in a major way until the 1950s, after this period. Uh, so that was interesting. If you just looked, their income was about half to a third the average American, and they were outnumbered too. So uh, Germany was kind of, he said if we were going to find a country today that was about the same as Germany relative to the United States, it would be like Iran, or maybe South Africa or something. So not a first-rate superpower, not by a long shot. Now, come back to the question of autarky. Um, the first problem with the assertion that availability of resources makes a country strong is that there are several countries, actually quite a few, that have enormous known reserves of precious metals and other resources that are poor. The two most glaring examples historically, and this has changed some in the last 20, 30 years, are the USSR and China. USSR is what, 3 times the size of the United States, and before the USSR, the Russian Tsarist state was at least double or 3 times the size of the United States, and probably something like double to 3 times the natural resources. They have enormous quantities of oil, enormous quantities of gold and coal and iron and zinc and all manner. The Ural Mountains, which kind of mark the border between Europe and Asia, at least by some geographers' accounts. But that's a mountain range that is very old and has been eroded away, leaving the only really the cores of the mountains, which is where the heavier elements are. So there's a lot of platinum and and gold and a lot of other uh, rarer earth elements that are right at the surface there. China's the same way. And then if we look at Africa, uh, many African countries are blessed with all manner of mineral wealth. And yet African countries are uh, just kind of cliched in their poverty. Uh, the Soviet Union was far less wealthy than the United States, especially if you compare standards of living. And I'd refer people to the Legal Immigrants YouTube channel. He did a great video comparing um, the standards of living. He's from the Soviet Union. He grew up there, and he was just going through and saying, "Well, what did we have?" And he's talking about growing up and it being a luxury to have toilet paper. Usually, they'd use old newspapers, and the availability of foods. I mean, most things weren't available, or if they were, it was only during seasonally and only under uh, kind of ridiculous uh, situations where you'd have to wait in line to get a coupon, then wait in line to get the good, and it might be not there, and it wasn't that high quality anyway. I mean, the furniture sucked. Everything was piss poor and inferior to what Americans take for granted, and even Americans took for granted 50 years before this. I mean, the comparison doesn't match up, and this doesn't make any sense because the Soviet Union is just full of resources, enormous amounts. And the other problem is that Russia, before the Soviet Union, has been around a lot longer than the United States, and this is even more true with China. These are states. In the case of China, you've had it like a pretty consistent state going back thousands of years, and so they've had thousands of years of literally thousands of years of head start. In the case of Russia, at least hundreds and hundreds of years of a head start in exploiting, I guess you could say, or maybe a better term would be developing their natural resources. You have capital accumulation in Russia and in China before there were any Europeans in North America. There were Native Americans in North America before this time, and Native Americans did develop resources. They weren't all totally scavengers, and there's a lot of debate about there may have been a lot more agriculture and a lot more civilization here than um, was apparent to the Europeans. It's possible that there were major plagues that kind of ruined society preceding major European observation. But in any event, whatever capital was here before before Columbus landed, was obliterated either because of disease or by the Europeans directly. So, Cahokia and Mesa Verde and whatever mounds or temples uh, Native Americans had managed to create contributed essentially nothing to the capital stock or the productivity of Anglo America. Um, we might make little qualifications here because the first Indians, like the Pilgrims, got help from the Indians, and maybe you know a bit of this stored up knowledge, and maybe how to grow local corn or something. You could say, well, that's from capital or whatever. So, not willing to say that there was zero inheriting of previous wealth, but it was absolutely minuscule. Um, or on the other hand, I mean, by that point, if we're talking about, say, the founding of Jamestown, the Russian state had been aggressively attempting to develop and exploit its resources for some time after that. China for thousands of years before that. And so they have all this head start. They have a huge head start in population. There's more labor in these countries. The population of the United States didn't reach 1 million and probably until some point in the 18th century. I'd have to check. It was 3 million by the time of the Revolution, uh, but that would have been just minuscule compared to China and pretty small compared to Russia. And so, the czars I don't know about during the Rurik dynasty, but under the Romanovs were actively trying to develop an industrial base in their country in several regions. And there are resources there capable of doing that because the resources are still there and are still capable of doing that. And yet, they are still far, far, far behind the United States, even though the United States had, they had a head start. I'm talking here about Russia and China. Um, so, what this kind of makes you think is that there's some other element here, some other necessary condition beyond just resource availability that is being overlooked. And I think my subscribers would all agree, and I think it's obvious to me that that element is the type of social system you have, how capital is created and allocated, how those resources are used, and that makes all the difference. If you have some central authority, whether it's a czar or a bureaucracy in China, I've had people come and say, "Oh, you just don't understand." The emperor of China, he had a huge bureaucracy of really intelligent people that were there to help society, which is fucking bullshit. They're there to help the emperor. And if and when the emperor's interests align with those of the people, then I guess you could say that that intelligent bureaucracy, these hyper educated eunuchs was what he was referring to. You could say, well, they're helping society, but whenever there's a conflict of interest between what's good for the emperor and what's good for the people, they work for the emperor. They're going to do what's good for the emperor. Also, they don't have the knowledge necessary to know what's the best use of all the resources. They can read as much as they want. They can be as innovative, as intelligent as they want. That doesn't give them the near omniscience that would be required to make decisions about, well, this or that resource should be best applied to this or that. That's something that you need a functioning price system, which means you need to have private property and free trade, and you don't have those in Russia and you don't have those in China, but you do have those to a large extent, a very large extent, maybe the largest extent in history in the early United States. And so what happens is you have lots of resources in China and Russia, but they are misallocated. And what do I mean by that? They are not used to satisfy the wants, the most desired wants of people. They're used to satisfy the most desired wants of, in the case of Russia, a person, the Tsar, and in the case of China, also a person, the emperor, or later, the party. So when these countries became communist, you just replace Tsar with Lenin or Stalin or Mao. So it's still one person, or perhaps one institution, maybe the Communist Party or the state generally, but never the greater society. In the United States, obviously you had a state, there are lots of problems in the United States, but there was private property, there still is, to a pretty decent degree anyway. Maybe we could debate that, but uh, especially early on, this was the case. And so what resources are available are much better coordinated. They are much more efficiently, and when I say efficiently, I mean to address the most desired wants of the people. And this is all based on the price system and profit and loss. And if you think a piece of land would be best used for X, and it's not what most people want, then you're not going to make a profit, and you're going to cease doing that. But if the czar thinks that this should be used for something, it doesn't matter how much it loses, they're going to keep doing it. I think my favorite example of this is during the Stalin period. There are deposits of gold in the Arctic. There are lots of resources in the Arctic, in Russia, but also in Canada and the United States, which is going to make a nice juxtaposition here. And he said, well, I have all this free labor, these slaves in the Gulag system, and there's all these resources, say up in the Arctic Circle or elsewhere in Russia, so I'm just going to force them all to go there and dig up the gold or whatever, or nickel or whatever other resource he's trying to get, which they would do. But then it was so cold up there, it was so the environment is so hostile to humans that it takes a lot of energy just to keep a person from dying. And so to keep them alive, I mean, you say, oh, he doesn't care about their welfare, but if every night all of them freeze to death, then there's no point in even trying. So what they would do is, train cars coming up with all the slaves would also carry lots of coal, and they had to build shelters and whatnot. And then the idea would they keep them warm, or at least not all dying every night, which is what can happen when it's that cold. And of course, the situation was still terrible, but you kept them alive long enough, and they start to mine gold. And so You have trains going up with slaves and coal and coming back with gold in them, right? Oh, win-win. Well, the value of the coal going north was greater than the value of the gold coming back. And what ended up happening is some of these gulags just became cities, and there's just there's large cities, the largest cities north of the Arctic Circle. I believe it's called Norilsk. It's in Russia. It has 250,000 people, and even today, even right now, it's a net drain on the economy because just to keep those people from freezing to death, even today, the current government of Russia has to subsidize them tremendously with coal shipments to keep them warm. If you look in, say, Alaska or the most northern reaches of Canada, there are resources too, but there are no huge cities. There are very small towns, uh, and resources are usually extracted by professionals who don't live there but who work, say, 2-week shifts. So the oil workers in Prudhoe Bay, they don't live there. There isn't a 200,000 man city north of the Arctic Circle that the rest of us are made poor to keep warm. There's small companies that just occupy very little space so it's able to efficiently be warmed, and they rotate in and out so that people don't have to live there and bring their families, and then you have to start keeping their families warm in addition to just the workers. And it's not because the government planned it that way, that's just the way that it makes economic sense. That's the profit and loss system. So it's vastly more efficient. More more is done with even smaller resources. They go farther. They do more to help the standard of living for an American than they do than an even larger amount of resources do for the average Russian or the average Chinese. Now this is obviously changing pretty radically in China, much less radically in Russia, uh, but that's the key. Now you might argue that well, you still gotta have the resources, so that's necessary, if not totally sufficient factor. Maybe, but I doubt it because you're able, even if you don't control the resources in your own political boundary, to import them. And this is what Germany and Japan have both demonstrated very well in the post-World War II era. Germany has become very wealthy. I think its per capita wealth is greater than the United States is now. They're similar. Uh, the average German today has more wealth than Hitler would have imagined the Third Reich ever having given them. Uh, and that was kind of the point, right? And the same thing with Japan. Japan, high standard of living, lots of exports, pretty advanced industry, and they don't have the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, basically the Japanese Empire, which is what they thought they needed to have to make all this work. You don't. The idea. Another thing Hitler kind of thought was, well, you need to have really efficient industry. You have to have really long series of production. So the reason Ford was so efficient, was able to make so many airplanes and tanks, is because he was able to build. He had factories that were geared towards supplying cars to 150 million Americans, whereas Germany, there's only 60, 70 million people back then, maybe, I don't know, 50, and so it wouldn't make any sense to, if you build a factory geared towards creating as many cars as Ford was, you wouldn't be able to sell them all. But the problem there is you wouldn't be able to sell them all in Germany, but you'd be able to find markets for them elsewhere. You know, the idea that, well, we don't have a big enough internal market to support industries large enough to be competitive. Well, then you just export. That's it. And Americans do that too, and we don't do it as much as we used to. Some of that's bad. Some of that's not bad. I think some of that is just an increased specialization. Some of that's the government's fucking stuff up. But so he was wrong about that. But you know, people love to bash on Hitler, and all these shows about how crazy he was. But all that stuff that I'm talking, all these fallacies he believes, most people today still believe. Most Americans still believe. Most people in the American government. What's the justification that we have to be at war in the Middle East? Well, oil. I mean, they won't say that specifically we went to war for oil, but because oil is so important, because there's so much there, then we have to have a stake in it. You know, that's the justification. And that is reasonable to people. People believe that. Not just Republicans, Democrats believe that. Oh, well, it is important, so we have to have political control. No, you don't. They're going to have to sell that oil. I think bin Laden once said, what are we going to do? Drink it? I mean, it's there. We know it's there. It's valuable. People are willing to pay for it. So, what's the huge impetus to have political control? Now, if you ask me, I think states are incentivized to use violence to do military expenditures, whether or not they need resources. They may very well believe that. That may increase the likelihood of their aggression, but it's not necessary. But they like to war and militarism is the health of the state. They know it implicitly, if not explicitly, and sometimes both. And so, they're encouraged to think along those lines. But I think robbing them of a material justification for it, uh, I don't think that's enough to stop war or anything, but it certainly can't hurt. So autarky is a stupid. Uh, I mean, it's they're like the United States, China, Russia. These are gigantic nation states. These are the greatest, largest nation states in history, and the idea that they're the only viable system is just silly because most states in history have never been that large or have that many resources. Most states today are not that large and do not have that many resources, and yet people manage to survive. And some microstates manage to survive extremely well. In fact, the highest standards of living are always in these very, very small states that don't have any resources worth mentioning anyway. So uh, that's it. This is a point, I thought about going into this in my last video, but that would be kind of like adding a half-hour elaboration to a half-hour video, and that's probably not usually a good idea. But all right, that's it.